All right, welcome back, everybody. Standard & Poor's downgrading California's debt rating, putting more pressure on Governor Schwarzenegger and lawmakers to try and tackle the state's deficit. We're going to go inside the Golden State's budget woes and what can be changed about all of this situation with David Crane. He's the special advisor for jobs and economic growth to Governor Schwarzenegger. And Mr. Crane, thank you very much for being with us today.
Good morning.
You know, we look around the country and a lot of states are having some massive problems right now, New York being one of them, New Jersey, but California always seems to head the list. You've got some big problems there. What can be done to turn things around?
Well, first you have to distinguish between California's economy and California's budget.
Yeah.
They're two very different animals. Our economy, while we were in a recession, last year we had negative growth of about 2.8%. Is still, or was still, the 22nd best performing economy in the country, according to the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. But our budget is another matter entirely. Our revenues are now down to levels that they were 6 years ago. And at the same time, we've got these escalating costs in the form of pension obligations that were really issued back in 1999 when the state legislature made a bet, effectively, that the Dow Jones would reach 28 million by the end of this century. And because of that, they issued debt obligations to government employees in the form of massive pension and retirement benefits that we're now paying for. Right. So we have to get our budget in order. That's why the governor has been proposing pension reform since he took office, and budget reform, have a rainy day fund and that sort of thing. And yesterday's announcement from S&P is just a wake-up call that the governor wants the legislature to act now on the budget, which is why he called them into special session. Let's take care of this problem earlier rather than later.
You know, David, what's happening in California is maybe an earlier, smaller scale of what's happening facing the United States as well. The federal government, when you start looking at some of these obligations and promises that have been made. We have David Walker on all the time who talks about how you can't really get people to pay attention until there's a crisis facing you at hand. California's certainly run into it. Why is it still so difficult to get past, even when people see the IOUs that the state was having to hand out earlier last year?
It's a very sad situation. David Walker is one of my heroes. He's been bringing the country's attention to this matter for decades now. Warren Buffett has been doing the same on pensions. I think it's because legislators have very short-term horizons. They're in office for a very short term. We have term limits in California, so who's going to take an action which will confer a benefit down the road when they're out of office and confer pain while they're in office? But you need to have a few legislators who are willing to step up and face this issue. It's really what we need in California is just a few good legislators to follow the governor's lead and address these problems. Otherwise, we're just handing a massive bill. And by the way, that massive bill takes the form of cuts to higher education in California, the University of California, California State University, which are the crown jewels of our economic development efforts. If we don't keep those humming, we will have lower economic growth in the future.
Yeah, as you point out, 30 years ago, California spent 3% of the budget on prisons and 10% on higher education. Now it's 11% on prisons and 6.5% on higher education. I mean, how do you do this without just massively paring down? How did it get so out of whack?
I tell you, it's a horrible situation, which is the reason that the governor in his State of the State address proposed a constitutional amendment to never allow prison spending in California to exceed higher education spending. The legislature is now taking that up, but already the legislature said, well, they're not so sure that's workable. There's an enormous amount of influence on the legislature by government employee unions who want to keep up spending on employee compensation, which shows up in all this prison spending. 75 to 80% of government budgets really take the form of employee compensation. Even the former mayor of San Francisco, Willie Brown, the Speaker of the Assembly in California, revered by Democrats, which also happens to be my own party, has come out and said, if governments don't address these programs, then these retirement expenditures, then progressive programs like higher education, health and human services, environmental protection will be squeezed out. There'll be no money to pay for them.
But David, why do you, as Steve Forbes here, why do you think there's a trade-off between prisons and higher education? I mean, there have been proposals of early release in California, and since most prisoners plea bargain, you're going to be releasing violent criminals. In terms of the pensions, why not really go for, instead of trying to turn back the clock to 99 for new employees, why not go, as the governor, I think, was once favorable to and got set back, to a 401k kind of system? So if you don't, the money's not there, you don't get the benefit. You won't have future legislators playing games as they did 10 years ago.
Well, a defined contribution could work fine. In governments, Defined benefits can play a meaningful role. I don't think that the problem so much is defined benefit versus defined contribution. The problem is defined benefit without appropriate limits. The single most important limit, by the way, is imposing a limit upon the investment return assumption that pension funds are allowed to assume when they tell governments how much they have to contribute. Governments, in fact, I think you were speaking earlier about Treasurer Angelides, who's now running this federal investigation. I think he was treasurer in California in 1999 when California made this determination that they could run up massive pension promises on a bet, really, that the Dow would hit 28 million by the end of this century. That's because of a high investment return assumption. If that's constrained, then they can't make those sorts of promises without incurring the pain currently.
Maybe that's an interesting question someone can ask Chairman Angelides today at those questions. Turn things around a little and ask him a question from those hearings today. David, we want to thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.